A total loss of Bitcoin is always possible, and you should be prepared for that. Now, the Volksbank and Raiffeisen Group is warning about this in a new viral TikTok video. And the coolest thing here are the comments, how people hate the banks that are attacking Bitcoin. Some people are spreading panic here that is completely unnecessary. The saying here is that you should only have a small allocation to Bitcoin because anything else would be too speculative. Real estate, stocks, and so on are represented much, much better than Bitcoin. And the Bitcoin community is really boiling over here. The comments are really delicious to look at here, as is the Volksbank and Raiffeisen Group's comment. We are looking into the whole thing because what is happening here is really highly explosive. The normal banks, the classic fiat, people really don't seem to understand what's going on here. We're witnessing the biggest money revolution of all time. And instead of relying on new technology, they say, no, we'd rather bet on the horse, we'd rather stay old school. We'd rather stick with landlines, even though smartphones have been around for ages. And that's basically what's happening here. And that's the important takeaway for you here. You really have to keep up with the times. It doesn't make any sense to shut yourself off from technology and innovation. In the end, the business model of many banks is definitely at stake here. And that's why it's understandable. I mean, it's kind of like the horse that says, okay, hey, I have to fight against the auto industry or something like that. And we're seeing a similar struggle with the banks here. They then say, hey, now there's something really cool here. It's much better than maybe our fiat money. It's much better than traditional banks. Now people can be their own banks, they can manage their own money, and they don't have to rely on others anymore. And in the end, it's really understandable why some banks are still very cautious and even aggressive about this, doing anti-Bitcoin advertising or something like that. We're about to check out the super explosive clip. But first, it's important to mention that there's a really big bank involved, the cooperative banks. Banks that have opened up to Bitcoin now, like VR Bank in the middle and so on, have rolled out a Bitcoin offering. But honestly, the majority of these banks are still completely oblivious to it. They're totally missing out on the absolute innovation. But folks, check it out, this clip is really something else. This has already gotten over 1 million views on TikTok. Hundreds of comments, thousands of likes. And now check this out.
Bitcoin hit above $100,000. I'm gonna get rich.
Congratulations, you made some big profits.
I haven't had any Bitcoins until now, but I'm jumping in now. It's all about...
So tell me, what do you think a fair value for a Bitcoin would be?
I've...
Even though there are models, no one can really determine an absolute fair value in the real world. Right now, the price on the market is fair based on supply and demand, but that can change quickly, either for better or worse.
Isn't that the case with other investments too?
Common investments like real estate or the companies behind stocks exist in the real world. They generate rents or revenues and profits. They can be measured and valued.
So cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin are riskier then?
You have to categorize them as quite speculative. So an investment can pay off or go sideways. That's why I would only invest a small portion of my money there, something I could afford to lose completely.
I mean, just look at this. Where have we ended up? Here the banks say, hey, just allocate a small portion to Bitcoin because you could end up losing it all. On the other hand, if you leave your money in the bank, you're guaranteed to lose it all. Of course, over a very long period, sooner or later. In the end, every fiat currency crashes. We just see it that statistically, the likelihood of a fiat currency crash is nearly 100%. So of course there are some fiat currencies that kind of currently exist now, but if we look into the past, there hasn't been any fiat currency that has existed here for any relevant period of time. Of course, there were still a few exceptions that somehow had the world currency or something like that, but on average a fiat currency only exists for 6 or 27 years. And that's why, in the end, a total loss is guaranteed if you just leave your money sitting in a fiat currency account for decades, whether it's in euros, dollars, or something like that. We can see that with a 2% inflation rate here, if you simply leave the money in the account, you are ultimately wasting more than half of your purchasing power. And then the banks say, be careful, only allocate very, very small amounts here to Bitcoin, because you could end up with a total loss here. And if you're going to invest in something, then do it in stocks or real estate, because they have real value here. There is something real behind them and so on. And Bitcoin has nothing real here. There's nothing real behind it. And that's an absolute misconception people have. It's just like saying, for example, X or something like that has nothing real behind it, but X also has a network effect. Just like with Bitcoin, there's a network behind it. That's obviously a certain amount of computing power. But Bitcoin is secured by hash rate. That means we have the proof of work consensus here. We can't just create Bitcoin out of thin air like banks do. We actually have to create Bitcoin through computing power. So the mining process, the process of mining Bitcoin, requires real computing power. And then here come the banks that can basically print money out of thin air. And they say that in the end, Bitcoin has no real connection or anything like that. This is ultimately perverse, but you also have to say that it is often the case that the banks themselves do not even understand how the whole thing works. They think, for example, that the loan one person gets comes from the deposits of another. This means that someone makes deposits here, and the deposits are then used to grant loans. That's the one. But what gets forgotten is that it's a fractional reserve system, where only a tiny, tiny percentage is actually backed. Money creation through credit happens out of thin air. So if I want to, for example, 100,000 US dollars, if someone wants a loan, then the banks have, I don't know, maybe 1,000 euros or something like that deposited. And the rest is just printed out of thin air. I mean, you can make a statement like saying, just a small allocation into Bitcoin to start getting a handle on the volatility and all that. But if you compare Bitcoin to other assets and then ultimately say stop, other assets have a better value here because they somehow have something real to do with the world. And so on, then it just ends up devaluing. This means that Bitcoin is essentially framed down. A corner is framed where Bitcoin ultimately does not belong. And I've said this before, that banks might be scared because their business model is basically dying. But on the other hand, banks could also position themselves smartly. They could actually offer Bitcoin loans, they could use Bitcoin as collateral, and they could provide Bitcoin custody services. There are all these brand new business opportunities here. And in the USA, that's exactly what's happening. Banks are starting to open up to Bitcoin. In Germany, there are still very, very few who have actually recognized this. The VR bank Banker Mit is an exception here. Most banks really haven't recognized it yet. But the comments here really killed me. That's really something else. For example, someone writes here, Philip says, never invest in a bank. And then the cooperative banks, the Raiffeisen banks say, why not? We're happy to provide on-site advice at eye level competently. Feel free to convince yourself. And then someone writes down here again, the claimed competence is publicly refuted by this video. So how awesome is this? Then the next dude writes here, because there's no good return, you shouldn't invest in a bank. So that is ultimately correct here. Crazy. That means that they say here, people invest in our banks, put your capital into our banks, but at the same time they put out such stupid videos where you can just see the pure incompetence and they don't even check that, in the end it is incompetence. That means they think that what they're publishing here is somehow, let's say, legitimate information. They don't realize that they're totally missing the boat on this. They don't realize that here the massive innovation is passing them by and then they basically want to get out of here. Selling horses, even though there are already space rockets out there. And that's basically the twisted world we live in. There are people who are still stuck in the past, still with horses and landline phones. And what do I know? And on the other hand, there is reality, and reality means we have space rockets, we have smartphones, we have space technology, of course, also in relation to money. We now have, for the first time, absolutely limited money that is super easy to transport, where we can even hold it in self-custody, and we're not dependent on banks. I'll drop a link down below to a TREZOR, a hardware wallet, how you can easily, securely, and simply store Bitcoin without having to deal with third-party risks. And for this hardware wallet, you can also get 10% off with the code Bitcoin Hotel. It's really, really crazy what's going on here. But hey, that's not all. Here, for example, people are commenting, this ad shows why you shouldn't be with the VR bank. And then the Volksbank and Raiffeisen group writes again, why is that? So they really don't seem to get it here. People are writing in the comments, hey, this is just bubbling over with incompetence. And the banks here just don't seem to get it. Here's another one saying, that's why you don't invest money through banks. And then they're writing again, why? And it's basically just like I explained. If you want to grow your money, you basically need to invest as little as possible in banks. That means only have as much money in euros or US dollars as you're. Be ready to lose because you're definitely going to lose purchasing power. Of course, not all at once or anything, but rather gradually. You're definitely going to lose purchasing power. And with Bitcoin, you should only invest as much money as you're willing to maximize your purchasing power. You have to keep in mind that this is a long-term game. If you're putting money into Bitcoin for just a couple of weeks, then that's definitely not a good idea. So your investment horizon should really be 4 or 5 years, or even better, 10 years. Then you're here. Historically, it's always been on the very, very safe side, even though this isn't really a pitch for Bitcoin. These are just pieces of information. In the end, you have to make your own decision about what the right investment vehicle is for you. Feel free to let me know in the comments whether you'd rather park your money with the Volksbanken or Raiffeisenbanken here, or if you'd prefer to park your money in Bitcoin. I'd really be interested to know. But the best comment was this one right here. Here, Tobias Henrik writes, man, this hurts to watch. And then here's the question again about the Volksbanken and Raiffeisenbanken. Why is that? They just don't seem to get it. And now here comes the answer, really brilliant, right on point. There's no fair value because it's just going to keep rising. So Bitcoin will continue to rise. Therefore, there is no fair value. 21 million divided by infinity. That's basically the value of Bitcoin. Secondly, Bitcoin exists in the real world just like everything else, just digitally, not physically. Or does this TikTok not exist either? So that hit hard. In the end, the thing is, okay, I ask now. A digital gold coin is more real than a digital Bitcoin or something like that. Or is the computer game more real than if I were somewhere in the garden, digging up trees? That's obviously just as real in the end. Even a dream is just as real as the physical. Of course, these are different spheres that you dive into here. A dream world is obviously something different from a physical world. or a digital world might be something different from a physical world. But those are all parts of our reality. And reality is made up of many, many different levels of consciousness, different, states of matter or whatever you want to call it. And if you then simply say, yes, okay, the digital, that is not real, but the physical, that is real, and so on, then you are isolating yourself and actually making a fool of yourself. And the value debate is always the same here. So there are always those people who say, yeah, the value of Bitcoin is infinite, and others say the value of Bitcoin is zero and a total loss, and so on. In the end, you can just break it down. Value is subjective. I've said this thousands of times. For everyone, value is something different. For the banks, they simply cannot see the value of Bitcoin because, firstly, their business model ultimately depends on it. That means that you cannot ultimately understand something if, in the end, your bread and your livelihood and so on depends on it. So you'd basically be shooting yourself in the foot, even though that's not really the case. Because you could also position yourself smartly here. You could basically be a first mover. But the banks are still so stuck in their thinking that they basically think, okay, with Bitcoin, we're just shooting ourselves in the foot here. And that's why they're really struggling to understand the whole topic here. But folks, really let me know how you see it. Are you saying that the banks are on the right track here? And then, of course, the whole thing about total loss is always a tricky subject. So a total loss is really, really unlikely. A total loss would mean Bitcoin dropping to $0. Even all the scam coins and shit coins that have crashed didn't fall by 100%, but only by like 99.9% or something. And by now, Bitcoin is so established that a total loss is really, really unlikely. A total loss of Bitcoin is definitely less likely than a total loss of the euro or the dollar. But feel free to drop me a comment on how you see it. If you want to buy Bitcoin, I'll put a link down below for you. 21 Bitcoin. How you can easily, safely, and simply buy Bitcoin. Here, with the code Bitcoin Hotel, you can get up to 20% off on fees when buying Bitcoin. Absolutely recommend it for beginners, pros, advanced users, whatever, your grandma, your friends. Anyone can buy Bitcoin here, super easy, safe, and simple. See you later. Peace out.